Hello, everyone, and today we're going to be focusing on African civilizations leading up to about 1400. So this is the fifth unit of the first topic, and if you remember, I apologize, this is the fifth topic of the first unit. The first unit of AP World History is meant for us to get kind of a sense of what's going on across the globe, and we go around from region to region to region, getting this constant idea of what's going on to kind of act as a starting point. And now we come to the continent of Africa, where we're going to focus on the sub-Saharan part of Africa, or that part south of Africa. And we will not waste any time. We'll get right to it. So as we take a look of Africa, one of the things is to understand how our understanding of Africa has been changing over the past 30 years. So we're going to get kind of big picture in a moment, looking at how historians have studied the history of Africa. And when we talk about history, one of the big things that I was always taught was that history is a memory of things said and done. And what we do as a community, as a society, is we try our best to agree upon a common memory. In other words, we create a common memory for everybody to kind of say, okay, that's what happened. Now, the old agreed upon versions, the old agreed upon memories are starting to become challenged. And we're in the state of historical flux where the memory that had been established is being challenged and reconciled with new information that's coming about. So much of the old memory of the development of Africa is influenced by Western bias. So for a long time, what people were taught about the development of Africa came from non-African sources. It came from Western scholars. And Western scholars, especially in the 19th and the 20th century, were heavily influenced by imperialism and colonization, which created an idea of a racist attitude towards Africa. The idea that the people of Africa were seen as less than Europeans. Now, we can take that racism even further back in time. But I would say in the 19th century, especially, this attitude of racism was particularly pronounced on a developing and increasing field of historical study. So in other words, I don't want to imply that racism began in the 19th century. What I'm trying to say is that in the 19th century, historical scholarship started to increase and develop. And it increased and developed particularly in the West, in Europe and the United States. And as the Western scholars studied Africa, the racial attitudes influenced and shaped the conclusions. And it influenced and shaped the memory that people agreed upon. And the other thing is the value that Western society places on print culture. One of the things that you've come to understand about history is that memory is largely backed up by written documents. And the idea that written documents are, the solid pieces of evidence that something happened. And in fact, we're very much influenced by this today. We are much more likely to believe something that is written down or published over something that we hear. So the print culture has a significant influence on the way we understand a history. And for a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, the history that is written about sub-Saharan Africa is largely written by European colonizers. So when we look at primary sources about sub-Saharan Africa, most of the time we're probably reading a European source. Now, lately we've been seeing more and more sources from non-Europeans describing sub-Saharan Africa. But in terms of sub-Saharan Africans describing themselves, we don't have so much printed resources. And that's because of letter C, the role of oral traditions within sub-Saharan African kingdoms or societies. So griots are people who preserve the historical knowledge of a community, of an empire, of a state throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The griots are almost like a walking, living library of knowledge. And for sub-Saharan African societies, this is indisputable history. When we argue over the memory of things said and done, this is an authoritarian source of information, the griots. However, in the Western society, oral communication is not held to such a high standard. Oral communication and oral tradition is looked at as being subjective and looked as being unreliable. And the printed word takes status. So what I'm trying to get at is that within Africa, we have this tension between the memory that has been passed down through African societies versus the memory that has been created by European scholars. And over the past 30 years, we've seen an attempt to reconcile those two to create a new understanding and a better understanding of the development of Africa. And that's where other disciplines become very important. Archaeology and anthropology, archaeology being the big one, has supplied a great deal of information that has challenged the traditional ideas of the development of Africa. And archaeology has contributed a great deal into shaping that memory of things said and done. Now, up to this point, I've been talking about Africa almost as if a monotheistic culture. And what I want to make sure you all understand is that, one, I don't see it that way. We are just getting into the study of AP world history, so it's important to start kind of big, and then we'll start coming down more and more to small specifics. But Africa is a diverse region made up of diverse language groups, made up of diverse ethnicities, made up of diverse states and diverse economies. It's not fair to say there's one monolithic culture of Africa. There is the Ghana culture, and there is the Kenyan culture, and there is the Nigerian culture. These cultures have some overlap, and they also have a great deal of differences. The same can be said about almost any region in the world. So we want to make sure that we see in Africa a very similar type of structure that we see in other parts of the world, where there is diversity within that region. But we also want to appreciate that what develops in Africa is unique to Africa and not necessarily alike other regions as well. So without much more talk about that, let's start talking about specific groups that shape the development of sub-Saharan Africa. We start first with this ethnic group called the Bantu. The Bantu are going to migrate out of sub-Saharan Africa, out of Western Africa, and they're going to start making their way down south through the continent. As the Bantu spread south throughout the continent, and this migration takes thousands of years, so we're not talking about something that happens overnight. It's not like an invasion force going on a military campaign. This represents about 13 to 1400 years of movement. And one thing that spreads is metallurgy. Metallurgy is the knowledge of how to take metal, heat it to the point that it becomes malleable. In other words, I can shape it, and I can shape it into tools. So metallurgy has been a piece of knowledge that had developed thousands of years before this particular example. And the Bantu had that knowledge. And as they spread through southern Africa, they spread that knowledge to the hunting and gathering groups throughout that region. So what happens is the hunting and gathering groups begin to learn new and better ways to make tools that help them live within society. But most importantly, what the Bantu do is they introduce agriculture throughout this region. Agriculture has a lot of effects in terms of the building of society. What agriculture does is it transforms the hunting and gathering unit into a stationary unit that doesn't move around, what we call sedentary, because they're staying in one spot, not moving. And they're using fields to grow crops. They're storing surplus crops to support what we might call specialization of labor. People who are able to serve in the military become kings and priests because they're able to have a food supply and they don't need to actively participate in the growing. So what happens with the spread of agriculture is that villages start to form around the farms. These villages begin to develop a complex political organization, and that leads to the development of chiefs. These villages are largely family-based, kin-based units of society. And what happens is that as those villages grow, they start to work with other villages. And what is unique to sub-Saharan Africa is that we don't see the big empires that we see in China or that we see throughout the Middle East. We don't see those big states popping up. We see a couple, but for the most part, there's this loose cooperation amongst villages. And they share common ethnicity, they share common language and common culture. And that's what we start seeing going throughout sub-Saharan Africa. However, by about 1000 CE, the population is growing so large that such a local way of running things is no longer effective, and a more central government is needed. And that's where you're going to see more and more centralized states popping up. The other thing that the Bantu do, along with metallurgy and agriculture, is they spread language. So, to make the analogy, the English language is based off of Latin roots as well as Germanic roots. So throughout a great deal of sub-Saharan Africa, the languages, even though they are very different in a lot of different places, they all stem off of the Bantu language. And the Bantu language serves as a basis for the language, just as Latin serves as the basis for English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian. So the last thing that we want to talk about, and this becomes a common theme, is that as new people come into a region, they also can spread epidemic disease. And in this case, the epidemic disease is malaria. So this is really the first time we talk about the spread of epidemic diseases. And especially given the situation we're in, it's something worth noting that when people move and start to interact with other groups of people, there is always the risk of a transference of a disease such as malaria that's going to have an impact on the population. And we're going to be seeing this more and more as we go through the semester. So, I want to do, before I go on to Roman numeral 3, an overview of the African states that are sub-Saharan. And we're really looking at 3 areas, and they're all circled here. So we have the West African imperial system. This is where some of the largest empires are going to grow and develop. And there's going to be a variety of them. The ones we're going to really focus on are the Mali Kingdom, as well as the Hassa Kingdoms. And we're going to focus on those 2 primarily. And then if you go to the east, to Ethiopia, there's a large kingdom that had developed back in the 1st century and is still there by the 1500s, and even goes past that point. And it is going to have a unique culture compared to other sub-Saharan states. And that we're going to refer to it as the Axon Empire, but also we can just refer to it as Ethiopia. And then in the southern central area, we see these kingdoms that we can call the Bantu states. And these are the states that largely grow out of that Bantu migration and that introduction of Bantu culture. And here we're going to focus on just one, the Great Zimbabwe Empire. So that's what we're kind of looking at. We're going to be hopping around from these 3 different areas. So let's start with the first thing. Let's go out to the east and look at the Axum Empire, what we would call today Ethiopia, even though it's not perfectly over Ethiopia. It's more to the northern part of Ethiopia, and then gradually moves south. So the Axum Empire begins to grow and develop because of the trade that comes out of the Mediterranean Ocean. I'm going to slide myself over. So the Roman Empire exists. And as you can see in this particular map, the Roman Empire has control of the lower Nile. And the Roman Empire is a Mediterranean power. So what the Romans did was they would move down or move up the Nile River, And then they would disembark, walk themselves to the Red Sea, and then flow out to the Indian Ocean. So there's a network of trade that's going on here. And if I can draw it, not that Romans did it, is that Romans connected with merchants who moved up and down the Nile. They connected with other merchants who moved up and down the Nile, who connected to other merchants who would travel overland to reach the Red Sea, that would deal with merchants who would go from the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean. So if you remember me talking the last couple lectures ago about the role and development of the Indian Ocean trade network, that's something that had been around since the Roman Empire's days. All it does is in the 800s, 900s, is it grows in popularity and activity. So what happens is that an empire taxes this trade activity. And as the trade increases, the empire grows, is able to afford a military, they conquer and they expand. This is a very common theme throughout history. States grow as the economy grows, and as the state grows, the economy grows further. Now, at some point, they either overgrow or the economy completely changes, and then we get a decline. But the big thing to see is that this interaction of this area of Africa with this part of the world brings them into connection with Judaism and Christianity. And what happens is Judaism initially comes in, and then Christianity, Christian missionaries and merchants begin to bring the religion, leading to the conversion of a king to Christianity, I believe in 350 CE. And with that conversion, this blue area becomes Christian. And as this empire of the Axum goes south into what we would call today Ethiopia, Christianity goes with it. And it's a very unique form of Christianity because of how it gets isolated from the Mediterranean world with the expansion of Islam. So as that religion, as we learned in another lecture, expands, and you get this spread of Islam throughout the region, the Axum Empire becomes isolated down here in Ethiopia from the Mediterranean basin. So they're going to develop a very unique form of Christianity and a much different form of Christianity. And we want to keep in mind that there's a kingdom down here that develops in Ethiopia, and it's a Christian, that's the continuity part. It's a Christian empire, but it's not Christian Roman Catholic, it's not Christian Greek Orthodox. It's almost like a third version of Christianity. Very unique and takes on the culture of that region. It's a powerful kingdom that's going to sit right here in present-day Ethiopia, and it's one that we'll revisit down the road. So we go next to the Hassa kingdoms between 900s and the 1800s. So now we're going to go out west. And if we look at what is today Nigeria and Chad, take a look right here. You're going to see between the Songhai and the Kanib, you're going to see the Hassa. And what this is are a series of villages that begin to come together and form into small kingdoms. There's 7 kingdoms all together, and these kingdoms are loosely connected. They work together, they're allied together, but otherwise they maintain their local power, their local control. And the Hassa kingdoms are going to form kind of a confederation where they work together and they cooperate, and they benefit from an increasing flow of trade, which we call the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. So what's happening in about the 500s, 600s, getting to the 700s, 800s, is that trade from the northern part of Africa is crossing the Sahara Desert and is coming into these political kingdoms, if you will, in the south. And this is what we call the Trans-Saharan trade, where you have northern merchants, largely coming out of the Middle East, traveling across the Sahara Desert, and arriving into these kingdoms of West Africa. And they're doing business. And we're going to talk more about this a little bit later. They're doing business. And of course, what do governments do? They tax the trade. that allows them a steady revenue, that allows them to increase and grow. And of course, not only does economic activity bring about political development in regions, but it also brings about cultural diffusion. And as merchants and missionaries make their way across the trans-Saharan desert, Islam begins to spread throughout the Hassa kingdom as well in about the 14th century. So now we see this religious influence developing and emerging throughout West Africa because of this trade network that it connects the two together. So those are the Hassa kingdoms. This, I apologize, should say, let me see here. That should say Roman numeral 5. Obviously, I forgot to fix my numbering as I was adding information. But we want to take a moment to look at the Mali kingdom. So further west, so your Hassa kingdoms would be right about here. Further west, 3 kingdoms are going to emerge. The Ghana kingdom, the Mali kingdom, and then the Songhai kingdom. All 3 of them are heavily influenced by Islam. So what you get is merchants coming across the Sahara Desert, a trans-Saharan trade network, bringing religion into these 3 areas. And I want to focus particularly on the Mali kingdom. The Mali Empire is about 1100s, 1200s, and we know so much about the Mali Empire because of a Muslim scholar named Ibn Battuta. So if you look at letter B, Ibn Battuta, he is a Islamic scholar who makes his way across the Islamic world. So you have this idea that here's this scholar that travels to the Mali Empire, travels to Egypt, makes his way throughout the Arabian Peninsula, makes his way all the way out through Persia to almost India. He is probably the most well-traveled individual of the 13th century. And a lot of what we know about the Mali Empire is written by him. And this represents kind of a part of history that we want to keep in mind, the travelers. And there's very few of them because traveling is very difficult and expensive. And Ibn Battuta, he travels the Islamic world and writes about all the areas that he goes to. On the other hand, you may know Marco Polo, a Venetian who travels across Asia to China. And a lot of what we know about China in the 1300s or 1200s comes from his writings. So these scholars are important resources. But again, going back to the idea that we're getting their perspective and their understanding of things. The way they describe things has to be fit into the world that they understand. So in the case of Ibn Battuta, he is very much a conservative Islamic scholar who sees a right and a wrong. And when he comes into the Mali Empire and watches how they practice Islam, he criticizes some of the things that they are doing as just being wrong. And that's coming from his perspective as a scholar. We're going to talk more about how documents and sources are influenced by their background as we go through the course. So the Mali Empire, let me focus on that. First, we will look at the economics. They tax trade that is part of the trans-Saharan trade. So the Mali Empire is engaged in a trade called the gold salt trade. What's happening is that Mali is a strong source for gold. There's gold all over the place. And of course, people to the north want that gold. What's lacking in West Africa is salt. Salt is important, not just to life. You know, we require salt. If our salt gets off just a little bit, we get all screwed up and all whacked out. So this gold salt trade is a prosperous trade. It's a very necessary trade, and it's a highly profitable, I think I just said that, profitable trade. And what the Mali Empire does is they tax that trade. And that's what allows them to grow in terms of strength and in terms of wealth. The Ghana kingdom taxed that gold salt trade as well, as did the Songhai kingdom. So that gold salt trade is going to play a critical role in the developments of these West African kingdoms, as well as the Hassa kingdoms to the east. And with the Mali Empire, I think I touched on the role of Islam, the idea that the Mali Empire takes this religion because of merchants who have arrived. The kings are practicing Islam, but they also are able to kind of bring the practices of Islam with the practices of their local traditions. And they bring together those two things, traditional religion and Islam tradition, together to create a unique expression of the religion in West Africa. Which then brings me to women in the Mali Empire. One of the things is that I've talked about this idea of the patriarchy, that women in China were extremely limited in their rights and abilities, thinking about foot binding. And I think I mentioned in one lecture that women in the Middle East were allowed to study scholarship, but they couldn't do it in the presence of men. And women were required to wear the veil to cover their heads and to cover their faces, in some cases the faces. In West Africa, women have a great deal more freedom than women in the Middle East and women in China would have. And women in the Mali Empire were allowed to associate with men outside of their family more freely, for example. And what happens is with the arrival of Islam comes the arrival of those attitudes towards women that we find in the Middle East. And what happens in West Africa is that while they may bring the religion of Islam in, they keep out those changes for the women. In other words, women continue to move about freely within society in a way that we don't necessarily see in the Middle East. Which brings me to an important point about culture, especially when it comes to gender relations. Culture changes very slowly, and that is evident throughout history. So even when we get a religion in, like Islam, and we see that many people change to that religion, the everyday practices of how women and men interact, that does not change as drastically because that's an ingrained way of doing things, and that is a very hard thing to change and alter. Now we come to Mansa Musa. I hope I said that right today. Here is a king that illustrates the wealth of the Mali Empire and its allegiance to Islam. So what happens is that Mansa Musa goes on a pilgrimage. He goes across the Sahara Desert, along North Africa, into the Middle East, and he goes to Mecca, which is one of the 5 pillars of faith, is that every adherent should at least once in their life, if they can, make the pilgrimage to Mecca. It's a significant holy experience for anybody who follows Islam. So what happens is that as Mansa Musa travels across this region, one, it shows us the interconnection of this world. So now we get to where the concept of Africa as it was taught in before the 1990s, and the 2000s, the old way of thinking of Africa is this underdeveloped, simplistic society that was really nothing until the Europeans arrived. But what we see with the Mali Empire and Mansa Musa is an extremely wealthy, complex empire that's interconnected with a larger Afro-Eurasian community. Here we have an individual traveling to the Arabian Peninsula. And the story is that wherever he goes, he spends lavishly. There are times that economies experience major booms just because of the arrival of this one individual. And then I want to talk about the city of Timbuktu. So one of the things that we're going to see when we talk about trade routes is that when trade routes intersect, we get the development of cities. And Timbuktu is one example of a city that develops because of the increased trade. Timbuktu is going to become a center of culture, a center of learning, a center of education, and a center of business. And I bring up Timbuktu because I want to point out that there's a city that reflects that interaction of different cultures and that interaction of diversity of ideas, diversity of peoples, diversity of religions going on within the Mali and then later the Songhai empires. So the Mali Empire, obviously, as much as I'm talking about it, is an important empire for us to keep in mind. Now, if we go out east to the eastern coast, we get the East African Swahili states. And I'm going to move myself down here. Maybe even shrink myself a little bit. Here we go. Sorry, I apologize as you look over this map. So one of the things is if we take a look at this region, we see a lot of city-states that develop along the eastern coast of Africa. And what's happening is that these people are engaged in trade going on through the Indian Ocean. So we've got Muslim merchants working their way down the coast. We've got several different ethnicities, different groups coming together. And the Arabic language is going to work its way down into this region. So what happens is that the Arabic language combines with Bantu. And you get a Bantu Arabic language coming together and developing into the language of Swahili. So the reason why we call these Swahili city-states, they're independent states. What they have in common is that language is Swahili, which is a combination of both Bantu and Arabic. And that is what we would refer to as a syncretic element. In other words, what's happening is that two things are coming together to create something, and that's syncretism. So as you might suspect, the religion of this region is going to be Islam. And that makes sense because of the arrival of merchants throughout this area. So it's interesting that here in Ethiopia, you have this largely Christian kingdom. And then to the north, in Egypt, you have an Islamic religion, where you have a kingdom that practices Islam. And as you come down this eastern coast, you get the same thing. So what we should be appreciating about Africa is just how Islam expands and develops because of mercantile activity here along the eastern coast and here within the western region. The Swahili city-states make their money off of trade. Once again, we come back to the importance and influence of trade, particularly through the Indian Ocean. And I'm going to bring out one city because we can name many of them. But Mombasa is one city that I want you to focus on and remember as an example of a Swahili city-state that grows and develops because of the trade that they engage in. And once again, this is reinforcing this notion that trade allows for the growth of political states. When there's political stability, trade increases even more. So the two reinforce one another. So that, I apologize, that should have been Roman numeral 6. I didn't change my PowerPoint numbering. I'll take care of that after this lecture. And then, lastly, I believe, we have the Great Zimbabwe. So when we look at this purple area, we see an inland kingdom that develops. And the basis for the wealth of the Zimbabwe state is the role it played in the Indian Ocean trade. So what's happening is that the Swahili city-states are receiving merchants from the Indian Ocean. And the merchants are demanding things such as gold, ivory, copper, timber. And what's happening is that the Swahili states are making inroads to collect those items. And of course, as you guys are probably catching on to by now, major empires are going to tax and regulate that trade that allows them to grow and to develop. And that leads us to the development of the Great Zimbabwe. So what's happening is that they're growing based off of the trade that takes place. We know in Zimbabwe that there is social stratification, which means there's an unequal distribution of wealth. We see an upper class, we see a lower class. So we understand that this is a complex society. And again, I come back to the very first thing I talked about, this idea that as we construct the history, as we construct the memory, we have to rely on many different approaches to bringing about that memory. In the case of Zimbabwe, archaeology has played a major role in showing what Zimbabwe looked like. And it's only recently that Great Zimbabwe has been brought more and more into the conversation of another example of a complex state that has developed in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. And it again challenges this notion that Africa was devoid of complex and well-developed empires and states. Again, this is probably the past 30 years that more of an emphasis has been placed on empires like the Mali, the Swahili city-states, the Great Zimbabwe. And when we talk about the decline of the kingdom, this fits into a pattern that we see in the Americas with the Mississippian cultures and with the Puebloan peoples of the Southwest United States. We're not quite sure why the Great Zimbabwe disappears. It could have been due to overpopulation. That simply put, there were not enough resources to sustain a population. And what happened was that as the population grows, they exhaust the land that is so critical to developing agriculture to support such a large population. The other possibility is that there is environmental changes. So, for example, if timber is one of the sought-after commodities, at some point you cut down so much of the woods that you lose the very thing that is the basis for your society. I apologize. My phone is ringing with potential spam. Hold on. There we go. So what we do know is that the Great Zimbabwe will decline and fall. And as we start to see the economy change, what these former empires and states are also going to change within Africa. So with that, I believe that brings me to the end of the lecture. So as you look back over the African civilizations, some of the things I want you to keep in mind are the different kingdoms that develop and the diversity of kingdoms. Some of them are large empires like the Axon. Some of them are small city-states like the Hausa, and also the African Swahili states, or Swahili city-states. Empires like the Mali, and significant kingdoms like the Great Zimbabwe. Those are all things that you want to keep in mind with this development of Africa before about 14 or 1500. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, make sure you're making any notes and questions for the next class. And I will see you next time as we get into the sixth topic of the first unit, which is Europe. In the meantime, have a great day. Have a great time till we see each other in class. Bye.